Chapter 24. The Last Day War on the Family. The Remnant of God's Family Kingdom. Section A. Family Unit versus the New World Order. The judgment culminates in a celebration of marriage when the channel of blessing is open. Under the influence of the blessing, God's children do not fear the judgment, but welcome it. We would expect that Satan would not sit idly by while this marriage is taking place. He wants to do everything he can to disrupt the marriage process and prevent as many people as possible from becoming part of the bride.
Revelation 12:17. And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ.
Satan is a keen student of Bible prophecy, and he knew when the judgment would commence. He knew that if he could cut the channel of blessing by disrupting the family unit and confusing the roles of husband and wife, he could draw people into a performance-based value system more easily and consequently cause people to be unprepared for the judgment marriage by either a fear of judgment or a dismissal of the whole concept as unchristian. As in the days of Nimrod, those who today are entrenched in the inherent life source model recognize that to control society, any authority structure or allegiance that stands in the way of or competes with the government has to be seen as a threat and must be eliminated. It is well known for those who research that there are small groups of wealthy people who wish to create a new world order. They want to shift from the divided nation states into a global system with one government, one economy, and one worship system. The Bible speaks of this coming system in the last days as follows.
Revelation 13:15-17. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak, and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name.
We are not going to focus on the issue of the mark of this beast power, but rather on the fact that it obtains power to kill or keep alive. It forces a worship system on everyone, and it can prevent people from buying or selling, so in essence, it controls the power of life and death, money and religion across the entire world. The setting up of such a system would be impossible if people maintain strong family ties and allegiances. It would also be impossible to force such a system on people for their own protection against terrorism if they have a strong concept of self-worth through the family channel system. So what is the point we are making? While God is preparing the wedding for his Son to the church, Satan is hard at work building a world order that does not allow the family channel system to operate. Looking at society, do we see an increase in the rate of family breakdown? I think that is fairly obvious to most people, but here is a quote anyway from Jim Conway.
In the 1950s, divorce was relatively uncommon and still not socially acceptable. That changed drastically in the next 2 decades. By the mid-60s, 1 out of every 3 marriages ended in divorce. By 1980, the rate was 1 out of 2. Jim Conway, Adult Children of Legal or Emotional Divorce, published by Monarch Publications Ltd., 1990, page 23.
Conway details several studies of the impact of broken families on children and their ability to live a reasonably happy and successful life. Again quoting from Conway.
As I read these studies, I realized what had happened to me. I understood why I always thought I had to try harder so people would like me. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. Finally, there were reasons for my feelings, and I was not the only one. Millions felt what I felt. Conway, page 37.
Section B. The orchestrated demolition of the family. This explosion of family breakdown has not been by chance. It is to be expected that before the end of time, when sin has reached its full extent, that all sorts of forces would come against our coming into a godly family blessing system. There are so many different pressures on the family in our modern era, and we want to highlight a few of them so that we can be aware of Satan's maneuvers. Bringing them to light can help us better prepare ourselves against the worldly influences that hinder the judgment marriage process that God wants to complete before the return of Jesus to claim his faithful bride. Section B1. The Education Revolution. The modern assembly line school system, where children are to passively sit for the majority of their day until they are at least 18 to be considered properly socialized, only began in the early 1900s. This system, which resembles a factory, or worse, a prison, was not what taught leaders like Washington, Franklin, Lincoln, Jefferson, inventors like Thomas Edison, writers like Melville, Conrad, and Twain, nor captains of industry like Carnegie and Rockefeller. Excuse the American focus here, as most of the information was from the USA. Many educators realize that our modern schooling system is broken in its ability to teach children. Most of us who have spent years in school, whether as a student or as a teacher, knows that the fundamental characteristic of schooling is boredom. But what if school does exactly what those in power want it to do? In the early 1900s, the lower classes were wanting more say in how society was run. The old aristocratic elite was feeling threatened by the upward mobility of the lower classes, especially in America, which was fast becoming a model of aspiration for the downtrodden in other countries. The long centuries of little change during the Dark Ages, the 1260 years as we noted earlier, were characterized by a feudal social structure, and the underclasses were trained to be obedient and unable to make their own decisions. The Reformation, the Enlightenment, democracy, expanding media, and the belief that man had freedom of conscience to judge for himself brought major changes to the human race, raising him up out of the darkness of illiteracy and unawareness. The years after 1844 were a time of great progress, but the old powers of the Dark Ages felt threatened by the change. One of the key ways to grind down the critical thinking, curiosity, and adventure of the freeborn child was the schooling system. Noted school critic and New York State Teacher of the Year, John Taylor Gatto, explains,
I began to wonder reluctantly whether it was possible that being in school itself was what was dumbing them down. Was it possible I had been hired not to enlarge children's power but to diminish it? That seemed crazy on the face of it, but slowly I began to realize that the bells and the confinement, the crazy sequences, the age segregation, the lack of privacy, the constant surveillance, and all the rest of the national curriculum of schooling were designed exactly as if someone had set out to prevent children from learning how to think and act, to coax them into addiction and dependent behavior. John Taylor Gatto. Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling. New Society Publishers, 2005.
This is a massive subject, and we by no means want to come across as giving a slapdash critique, but we want to give a few more points so that it is clear how it is that modern education attacks the family relational system. It is the opposite of relational, because it is designed to produce humans who fit in the corporate, efficiency-based society of the state. Gatto talks of reading the book The Child, the Parent, the State by James Bryant Conant, president of Harvard for 20 years and a giant of the 20th century, who mentions this school revolution in the early 1900s. Conant directs the reader to a book written in 1918 by Alexander Inglis, an earlier leading Harvard educator, named Principles of Secondary Education. In this book, Inglis lays out 6 functions of school, and Gatto gives his commentary on them.
1. The adjustive or adaptive function. Schools are to establish fixed habits of reaction to authority. This, of course, precludes critical judgment completely. It also pretty much destroys the idea that useful or interesting material should be taught, because you can't test for reflexive obedience until you know whether you can make kids learn and do foolish and boring things. 2. The integrating function. This might well be called the conformity function because its intention is to make children as alike as possible. People who conform are predictable, and this is of great use to those who wish to harness and manipulate a large labor force. 3. The diagnostic and directive function. School is meant to determine each student's proper social role. This is done by logging evidence mathematically and anecdotally on cumulative records, as in your permanent record. Yes, you do have one. 4. The differentiating function. Once their social role has been diagnosed, children are to be sorted by role and trained only so far as their destination in the social machine merits, and not one step further. So much for making kids their personal best. 5. The selective function. This refers not to human choice at all, but to Darwin's theory of natural selection as applied to what he called the favored races. In short, the idea is to help things along by consciously attempting to improve the breeding stock. Schools are meant to tag the unfit with poor grades, remedial placement, and other punishments, clearly enough that their peers will accept them as inferior and effectively bar them from the reproductive sweepstakes. That's what all those little humiliations from first grade onward were intended to do: wash the dirt down the drain. 6. The propedeutic function. The societal system implied by these rules will require an elite group of caretakers. To that end, a small fraction of the kids will quietly be taught how to manage this continuing project, how to watch over and control a population deliberately dumbed down and declawed in order that government might proceed unchallenged and corporations might never want for obedient labor. That, unfortunately, is the purpose of mandatory public education in this country. And lest you take Inglis for an isolated crank with a rather too cynical take on the educational enterprise, you should know that he was hardly alone in championing these ideas. Conant himself, building on the ideas of Horace Mann and others, campaigned tirelessly for an American school system designed along the same lines. Men like George Peabody, who funded the cause of mandatory schooling throughout the South, surely understood that the Prussian system was useful in creating not only a harmless electorate and a servile labor force, but also a virtual herd of mindless consumers. In time, a great number of industrial titans came to recognize the enormous profits to be had by cultivating and tending just such a herd via public education, among them Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. John Taylor Gatto, Against Schools, Harper's Magazine, 2003.
We need not admit of a great conspiracy to see that for many people in power, these functions of schools are highly attractive, even if schools were changed, starting later in life and having less hours. Like the much better school systems in Scandinavian countries, modern society makes reform difficult. Schools work as places to babysit kids, for parents who both need to work to have enough money to live, in contrast to in the past, where one breadwinner could make enough. Teachers' salaries are low, and additional administrative burdens increasingly placed on them that take their energy off of teaching, and a society that in a variety of ways encourages children to disrespect authority. Gatto makes this point.
The reasons for this failed school system can stem purely from fear or from the by now familiar belief that efficiency is the paramount virtue, rather than love, liberty, laughter, or hope. Above all, they can stem from simple greed. There were vast fortunes to be made, after all, in an economy based on mass production and organized to favor the large corporation rather than the small business or the family farm. But mass production required mass consumption, and at the turn of the 20th century, most Americans considered it both unnatural and unwise to buy things they didn't actually need. Mandatory schooling was a godsend on that count. School didn't have to train kids in any direct sense to think they should consume nonstop, because it did something even better. It encouraged them not to think at all. And that left them sitting ducks for another great invention of the modem era, marketing. Now, you needn't have studied marketing to know that there are two groups of people who can always be convinced to consume more than they need to: addicts and children. School has done a pretty good job of turning our children into addicts, but it has done a spectacular job of turning our children into children. Again, this is no accident. Theorists from Plato to Rousseau to our own doctor, Inglis knew that if children could be cloistered with other children, stripped of responsibility and independence, encouraged to develop only the trivializing emotions of greed, envy, jealousy, and fear, they would grow older but never truly grow up. In the 1934 edition of his once well-known book Public Education in the United States, Elwood P. Cubberley detailed and praised the way the strategy of successive school enlargements had extended childhood by 2 to 6 years, and forced schooling was at that point still quite new. This same Cubberley, who was dean of Stanford School of Education, a textbook editor at Houghton Mifflin, and Conant's friend and correspondent at Harvard, had written the following in the 1922 edition of his book Public School Administration. Our schools are factories in which the raw products, children, are to be shaped and fashioned, and it is the business of the school to build its pupils according to the specifications laid down. It's perfectly obvious from our society today what those specifications were. Maturity has by now been banished from nearly every aspect of our lives. Easy divorce laws have removed the need to work at relationships. Easy credit has removed the need for fiscal self-control. Easy entertainment has removed the need to learn to entertain oneself. Easy answers have removed the need to ask questions. We have become a nation of children, happy to surrender our judgments and our wills to political exhortations and commercial blandishments that would insult actual adults. Gatto against Schools, Harper's 2003.
God's family kingdom requires mature adults, understanding the responsibility of authority, to be able to bless those that are under them in the relational kingdom. Schooling makes many hate authority figures because authority has forced them inside a classroom for the entirety of their childhood, with no freedom or say in how their time is used or what they can study. Many children spend little time learning with their parents who love and care for them, and much time learning from teachers who often do it only for money and have little motivation and energy to give specialized attention to any particular child. Having had years of training in how to memorize rather than learn, heads filled with disconnected info and little critical thought, men and women of modern society have great difficulty making the long-term imaginative and moral calculations necessary to build a community of godliness and decide to join Christ in the most holy place. The seeds of the 60s revolution was laid in the undermining of traditional family authority structures from the 1920s through to the 1950s. It was a revolt against the stale institutions and the uninspired grind of modern life. This revolution had some good critiques, but Satan was also able to channel that youthful passion and frustration against the family, against God, and against any type of authority. A huge influence on the thought of this new generation of youth who lived in a new world of plenty in contrast to their parents' war-torn era of scarcity was music. Section B2. The Music Revolution. Plato stated a long time ago, "Let me write the songs, and I care not who makes the laws." There is nothing that can move the heart like music. If the music of a nation can be influenced, then you have a direct ability to move the hearts of a nation. In Satan's war against God's family kingdom, he knew that if he could control music, he could control the hearts of men and women and further prevent them from wishing to attend the wedding in the most holy place of the sanctuary. The music needed would seek to undermine existing authority and parental authority particularly. This description is the history of rock and roll. Through the development of records, radio, and post-Second World War freedoms, young people across Western societies were exposed to the phenomenon of rock music. A cultural war erupted between generations, and the lively appeal of rock music took the new generation of the 50s down a path where traditional family values were replaced by communing with popular culture, culminating in the Woodstock phenomenon.
Footnote: Woodstock was the watershed rock and roll festival that took place in Bethel, New York, from August 15th to 18th in 1969, and has become the icon of 1960s counterculture music. End footnote.
With the aid of the transistor radio, teens could listen to the new music form in their bedrooms and imbibe the principles of counterculture. The essence of the music was anti-authority, anti-family, freedom of the individual to do as they pleased, and an emphasis on the moment over long-term considerations. The music was also extremely feminized through the expressions of long hair, high voice, and heightened emotional expression in a male form. This confusion of gender and the unrestrained sexual expressions associated with it has been a key factor, is breaking down and destroying headship and submission principles in a traditional family structure. God designed the family that men would have an image of his government and his commitment to relationships. Marriage was for life, for the sake of the children. Sex was holy, because a child could come out of the union and raising a child was no game. But advances in contraception, particularly the birth control pill, allowed people to forget a potential child when they had intercourse. They could give themselves solely to their lusts and not think about the long-term implications of their actions. There was no need to put much thought into one's partner. Hedonism became normalized, and drugs and alcohol added to this environment where instant gratification was paramount and guilt and shame pushed away. The influence of pop culture through new entertainment technologies, in addition to the extended childishness and need to conform to your peers of schooling, was putting increasing pressure on the family. Added to that was another revolution, and the traditional family was in complete upheaval. Section B3, the Feminist Revolution. This revolution is probably best symbolized by the Helen Reddy song, I Am Woman, which galvanized millions of women around the world to fight for their rights and be released from the bondage of housework. It must be admitted that the lot of women was made hard by many men in the era preceding the 1970s, and some of the social reforms have been beneficial. Unstable men, living in a society where power and performance is everything and anyone can be a threat, are often incapable of loving and caring for women and children. Instead, to ease their insecurities, they seek to dominate and control them. But the feminist revolution has added to the problem. It has put oil on the fire of the war between the sexes, adding to competition and bitterness, and caused increasing miscommunication between men and women. Men are seen as unreliable by women, and women are seen as conniving by men. Contempt for men is seen in statements such as this by young Hollywood actress Lena Dunham.
I'd honestly rather fall into a million manholes than have one single dude tell me to watch my step.
A statement like this shows how broken male-female relationships are and how we have been taught that we can only rely on oneself and on no one else. Fending for yourself and doing everything on your own inherent power is extremely difficult and exhausting and is not what God intended for us. He set up the family where unconditional love and trust would protect us from the challenges of this world. And he set up a church to do the same for communities. But feminism teaches that women can do it alone. No matter what you believe politically, it can be safely assumed that a single-parent family, no matter how loving, is not as optimal as two loving parents.
40% of American children are now born to single mothers. This rate of non-marital births, combined with the nation's high divorce rate, means that around half of all American children will spend part of their childhood in a single-parent home. Social scientists across the political spectrum agree this family chaos is destructive. In 2017, the poverty rate for woman-headed families with children was 36.5%, compared with 22.1% for father-only families and 7.5% for families headed by a married couple. And abundant data show married adults are happier, healthier, and wealthier than singles. The sexual revolution has scythed through the institution of marriage, leaving millions of women without the love and emotional and financial security that they and their children so need. It hasn't been a picnic for men either. Recent studies about the effects of fatherlessness have revealed that the rise of single-parent, which usually means mother-only families, has had even worse consequences for boys than for girls. Father absence in African American homes leads to more mental health and behavioral problems for boys, according to an MIT study by two economists looking at brothers and sisters born in Florida between 1992 and 2002. Growing up in a single-parent home appears to significantly decrease the probability of college attendance for boys, but has no similar effect for girls. They found other worrisome effects, too. Fatherless boys are less ambitious, less hopeful, and more likely to get into trouble at school than fatherless girls. Everything is connected. When more boys are growing up without fathers, there are fewer young men who become the kind of adults women want to marry. Educated, employed, non-drug abusing, and not involved with the criminal justice system. Without the grounding of marriage, men become disconnected from society. Some 22% of prime-age men, 25 to 54, are not working or looking for work. Unmarried men are overrepresented in this group. By contrast, married men with only high school diplomas are much more likely to be employed than unmarried men with some college or an associate's degree. Diseases of despair, alcoholism, overdoses, suicide have been rising among white working-class Americans, the very population that has witnessed a steep decline in family stability over the past several decades. Most women want and need upright, well-adjusted, dependable men to serve as co-anchors of healthy and happy families. The feminist movement was deeply misguided to take aim at marriage. Far from oppressing women, it offers a safe foundation for a full life.
Footnote: Mona Charan. Feminism has destabilized the American family. New York. Post, July 7, 2018.
As the principles of so-called freedom and independence spread all over the world, divorce, despair, and substance abuse issues follow in its wake. Married couples work all day, often socializing much more with their co-workers than with each other, opening the door to much opportunity to unfaithfulness, particularly as modern men and women are insecure and use the push and pull of seduction and desire to feel valuable and increase excitement in boring jobs, which they struggled through years of boring school to attain. This is where the lie of inherent power has taken us, a broken world in which most cannot imagine any other way of living. This is not to blame all the failings of society on just these three revolutions. The average amount of money being earned by people, adjusted to inflation, has stagnated, while the costs of many goods and services has increased, putting much pressure on individuals and families. Debt has skyrocketed. The move into the cities has cut many off from nature, much to the detriment of their mental health. Diets have gotten worse. Television and video games have taken the place of physical play and interaction. People move more often, losing contact with extended family and childhood friends. People live next to each other but have no history with each other. The list goes on and on. It does not take much looking around to see that Satan has pretty well triumphed over God's family kingdom system in these last days. Thankfully, the final chapter has not been written. The seed of the woman will triumph over the seed of the serpent, and all the plans of the world's tyrants will ultimately fail. Just before the Lord returns to bring about the ultimate family reunion, God sends a message that will awaken people to family values and the importance of the channel of blessing system through the role of a father. It is to this message we turn next.